In this Torah portion, 12 tribes. Did the original list include Manasseh and Ephraim?
Did Jacob buy Shechem with money, or did he take it with sword and bow?
Chapter 49, verse 25. Is El and Shaddai two different entities?
If Genesis is the beginning, then this Torah portion is the beginning of the end.
Who is the angel that redeemed Jacob?
Let's jump in, Jono.
G'day, dear viewers, and thank you for your company once again here on truth2u.org. That's truth, number 2, letter U.org. I'm Jono Vandor, and joining me from the Horeb Institute in Louisiana is the author of the Moses Scroll, Ross Nichols. G'day, mate.
Hello, Jono. How are you, my friend?
I'm a bit excited, Ross, because we're coming to the end of Genesis. That is 1 out of 5 done.
Man, can you believe that? It is the end of the beginning. This is the book of beginnings, and if this is the book of beginnings, this is the end of the book of beginnings. It's the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. Go ahead.
The end of the beginnings. Torah Pearls Season 3, of course, and brought to you by Tanakh Tours, T-A-N-A-K-H, TanakhTours.com. Join us. Let us take you around Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. This week we're at the end of Genesis. This is VaYechi, and joining us is our AI critical scholar, Ezra. Ezra, will you kick us off with a summary?
VaYechi, the final portion of Genesis. It's a tapestry of legacy, blessings, and transitions. We find Jacob nearing the end of his life, gathering his family in Egypt. He blesses Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, setting Ephraim above his older brother, a theme of younger sons being chosen that we've seen throughout Genesis. Jacob then delivers a series of poetic blessings, or prophetic insights, over his 12 sons. These are as much about their future tribes as their personal traits, often loaded with metaphors and allusions. Judah is singled out as the leader, with imagery of kingship, while Joseph receives abundant blessings tied to his role as a provider and preserver. Finally, Jacob dies and is embalmed, with his body brought back to Canaan for burial in the cave of Machpelah. The portion concludes with Joseph reassuring his brothers, after Jacob's death, that he harbors no ill will for their betrayal. Joseph himself dies, leaving a powerful promise: God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here. It's a beautiful bridge to Exodus, steeped in themes of hope, forgiveness, and covenant continuity.
A beautiful bridge, Jono.
I was just about to highlight that myself. It is a beautiful bridge to Exodus. We'll be there next week. But yeah, it is. It does record Jacob's death, but that's not the way that our Torah portion kicks off, Ross. It begins with Jacob lived.
Yeah, VaYechi. In fact, by the time the end of this Torah portion, we've got all of the patriarchs are dead, including Joseph, and really, I mean, this is the end. All the matriarchs are dead. But as you so rightly pointed out, VaYechi, I thought about that a little bit this week as I was preparing my notes, and I think, and maybe you can correct me, but it feels like I think that as we read through the Hebrew Bible, the emphasis is on the life of a person, maybe more than on the death. And the reason I say that is because we've got several examples that I wrote down. If you look at, let's look at a couple of them, Jono. Look at Genesis 23, for example, verses 1 and 2. Some of our viewers have the Genesis tablet, and that's on page 110, Genesis 23, 1 and 2. It begins, now this is from Torah portion Chaye Sarah. The life of Sarah was 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah, and Sarah died. So it's almost like the emphasis, it begins in several of these examples with this person lived, this was the life of, and then it, it doesn't shy away from the fact that death is inevitable, but there's something about the life. One more, look at Genesis 25, verses 7 and 8. And I've got several of these, but just to highlight this point. And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived, 160 years. And this says, and Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age. An old man and full of years was gathered to his people. So we get these examples. Now, I don't know if this pattern holds true all the way through the Pentateuch, but I certainly noticed it was a sort of a stylistic way of recording these things by the scribe in Genesis, or scribes, I
Hmm.
should say, and then we enter it again. So one final point on that, it reminded me of a verse that we're going to encounter in the first Torah portion of Exodus, and that is Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, where it says that where God introduces himself as the God of the living. And so,
Right.
there's this
Yeah.
idea. Anyway, I don't want to make too much out of it. I don't want to get too out of this world with it, but it certainly is on my mind as I read through some of these texts.
I like that. I'll tell you what's on my mind. And we've already mentioned this a couple of times, but I think it's worth revisiting again. Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt, so that the span of Jacob's life came to 147 years.
Right.
And as we've discussed before in previous Torah portions, it's necessary that he does live to 147 to complete what is clearly a crafted and intentional mathematical equation. Just to remind everybody, Jacob lived for 17 years in Egypt. Joseph was 17 when he was abducted
Right.
and taken to Egypt. So the first 17 years of Joseph's life is spent with Jacob. The last 17 years of Joseph's life is spent with Jacob when they're reunited. And the ages of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob also, according to this particular equation, add up to 17. What you have is Abraham, as you just mentioned, 175. That's 7 times 5 squared. Isaac, 180 he lives to, which is 5 times 6 squared.
Yeah.
Jacob, in this case, 147, which is 3 times 7 squared. And if you add those numbers instead of multiply them, 7 plus 5 plus 5 equals 17. 5 plus 6 plus 6 equals 17. 3 plus 7 plus 7 equals 17. Clearly by design, clearly crafted, and it had to be. The author made it so that Jacob would be 147. Fascinating.
And just, I've said it so many times, I'm not going to say how much I dislike math, but I do recognize the patterns that you're bringing up. And one of the things that's interesting is I brought this up last week because you've brought this mathematical idea in front of me every week. And it is interesting that a sofer is one who counts. A scribe, we know that that's one of the ways that they, at least by the time we get to the Masoretic text, there are very strict rules in place as to how many letters and so forth. So they would count these, and so maybe this math is almost like it's part of the text. It's built in, almost like a checks and balance. Again, particularly once the Masoretic text is there. That way you could add it and you could see, is it right? Are we off any?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's fascinating. It just shows that it's crafted, from all the way from Abraham. And I know we have various sources, but whichever particular source this is, I mean, it's really very clever.
Yeah.
14, chapter 47, 28 to 31, Jacob's death seems imminent. Now, this reminds me, Ross, remember Isaac, he's like, oh man, I'm going to die soon. Esau, go and catch some game, that I like, make that stew for me because it's like my final meal, I'm really looking forward to that. And then I'll bless you, because I am on my deathbed. And then he lives for another 43 years, because we're dealing with a couple of sources. It's very, very clear in that one. Well, this one just reminds me a little bit of that.
Sure.
Because it seems like Jacob's death is imminent. However, in 48:1, it begins, 48 says, and sometimes afterward, and then it goes on, and there seems to be a little bit more time. What are the sources, Ross? Are we dealing with various sources here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because if you look at verse 29, that's J, and the time drew near that Israel must die, and he calls his sons. And you get down to chapter 48 and verse 1, that's E. So it is fascinating when you look at these, and we've had several comments, just maybe emailed or even comments in the chat during these discussions that we're having, and there are questions around, have you totally bought into the documentary hypothesis? One thing that we've both made pretty clear that what seems to be obvious, whether a person ascribes to the documentary hypothesis or not, is that we have distinct sources, different stories told by different authors, and it becomes clear. And we're going to see some of that in almost every every discussion that we have.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that, just jumping off this just for a second. I was thinking about that today, Ross, because for you and I, well, I'll speak for myself. I'm really quite convinced that the Moses Scroll is an authentic Dead Sea Scroll, that it is original, that it's before our canonical texts. And as such, I no longer feel the need to default to the fundamental position of having to defend, the contradictions or the difficulties and this, that, and the other, or the outrageous claims even that we read in the first 5 books. I'm quite at ease having my anchor in the Moses Scroll with now questioning this, and it seems to go hand in hand, or now I feel free, I suppose, to investigate the documentary hypothesis and give it the benefit of the doubt. And as you say, it's not necessarily that we, like, various scholars might disagree with each other as to where one source starts and where another one begins. There is a general consensus, but that happens.
Yep.
And that's fine, for sure. So when someone says, "Oh, you must agree with the documentary hypothesis," well, according to which scholar,
right?
But what, and I think this is your point. What is just incredibly obvious, and I think everyone must agree with us, having worked through the whole book of Genesis now, there is clearly more than one author at hand here, 2 or 3 authors at hand, possibly 4, that have contributed to this incredible collection. So there is that.
Yeah.
What I would like to do is now. I think, Ross, it's my opinion that the whole book of Genesis, being from various sources, has been cleverly crafted together to arrive at this moment in chapter 48. I think this is the most important moment. This is the aim of the entire direction of Genesis, was to come to chapter 48, verses 5 and 7, where the entirety of chapter 48, where Jacob, or Israel, adopts Ephraim and Manasseh.
Wait.
I was wondering.
Wait,
go ahead.
1 second before you jump to verse 5 and 7. Let me say something about, because I don't want to have to come back, because I'm anxious to hear what you got in 5 and 7. But it's interesting to me that this particular chapter, if you look at verse 3, that's where P begins. Okay, so 48 verse 3, and Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared unto me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I'll make thee fruitful and multiply thee, and I will make thee a company of peoples, and will give this land to thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession. Now, Jacob is relating a story about God Almighty appearing to him at Luz, and it came up in a previous discussion, but I don't want to go past this yet, because it's one of the rare occasions that the text was not later edited and updated. Most often that we find in not only the Pentateuch, but the rest of the Bible, anytime you say, you would talk about Bethel, and then you would say it was called Luz at first.
It was called Luz, so right? It's not here. I was going to ask you about that. I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah.
This text, interestingly enough, says God Almighty, which happens to be P's version of the name of God. We'll see this more and more as well in the time of the patriarchs. So again, it doesn't mean, what it means to me is that this is a potential or potentially evidence of an older text, or at least one that escaped an upgrade in the editorial process, if that makes sense. It wasn't changed. So I find this very interesting.
I found that interesting too. When I read Luz, I thought, hang on a second, didn't we change it to Bethel?
Where's Bethel? No mention. Yeah.
Oh, good stuff.
The only other thing that I'd just like to touch on, and I just want to leave it with the viewer, we don't have to go there, but notice Jacob says that El Shaddai appeared to him and said, "Behold, I will make thee fruitful and multiply thee, and will make of thee a company of peoples." Now, I don't want to get too picky, but what I want to do is I want to say, how accurate is he recalling what El Shaddai told him at Luz? So this is just a challenge, and then I want to get to your point because I just want to plant the seed. These are the kind of things that make me go back and say, okay, we have a couple of accounts, Genesis chapter 32 and Genesis chapter 35, and actually Genesis chapter 28, where God appears to Jacob, and what does he tell him? Which one is it that matches most closely to this? All right. So I just wanted to plant that. Just
okay.
Let people
All
look.
right. So that's some homework for the
That's
viewers.
Right. That's right.
Good stuff. I like it. Hey, listen, let me get Ezra to read this before we do, because I want to read a note out of the Jewish Study Bible. So, Ezra, maybe you can read chapter 48, verses 5 to 7.
And now thy 2 sons, who were born unto thee in the land of Egypt before I came unto thee into Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh, even as Reuben and Simeon, shall be mine. And thy issue that thou begettest after them shall be thine. They shall be called after the name of their brethren in their inheritance. And as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died unto me in the land of Canaan in the way, when there was still some distance to come unto Ephrath. And I buried her there in the way to Ephrath. The same is Bethlehem.
Same as Bethlehem. So before I unpack this, Ross, I'd like to just read a little bit from the note in the Jewish Study Bible on this one. And it says, Jacob adopts his 2 grandsons born in Egypt, explaining this by reference to his affection for their departed grandmother Rachel. This promotes them to the status of tribal founders and makes his favored wife their mother in place of the Egyptian priest's daughter, Asenath. Moreover, the end of verse 5 seems to mean that Ephraim and Manasseh will become the senior tribes, replacing Reuben and Simeon, both of whom earn their father's censure. It goes on to say, note that whereas some lists of the 12 include Joseph and the clerical tribe Levi, others omit Levi and divide Joseph into Ephraim and Manasseh. Or do they? The question that I have is, in fact, is Ephraim and Manasseh the original tribal list, and that Joseph might be added later? So before I go any further with that, I want to talk about, let me sort of, hey, you know what? Before we do any of that, let me get, because it reminded me of something before I go any further, and this is just jumping off that idea. Ezra, maybe I can get you to read Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 to 17.
If a man have 2 wives, the one beloved and the other hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be, in the day that he causeth his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved, the firstborn, before the son of the hated, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the hated, by giving him a double portion of all that he hath, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his.
All right.
What do you make of that, Ross? What do you think? That just pops into my head, and I thought that just seems like such a specific dig to this particular narrative. We know that the law code of Deuteronomy is not derived from the Moses Scroll; it's added much later. And I wonder how these two connect. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, let me ask you this: do you think maybe that, because we always have to think about derivation? Someone might read this and see, well, Genesis, the patriarchal narrative, comes first, and therefore Deuteronomy is in some way dealing with that situation that might have been a problem. Or do you think it's the other way around? Did I word that correctly? In other words,
I get what you're saying. I honestly do not know. I really honestly do not. I don't have a learned enough opinion on that, but I would, if I had to throw $20 on one of these, I kind of feel like this verse in Deuteronomy seems like it's a response specifically to this to this outcome. But
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
but I really could be wrong. Do you have an opinion either way?
No, I don't. I have a similar opinion about the law code, Deuteronomy chapter 12 through 26 being very late, and almost all of academia places it extremely late, 7th century BCE. And there are reasons for that, by the way, and we can talk about that, but we're going to talk about that a lot when we get to the law code. So
When
I
we
don't
get
want
to
get into
Deuteronomy.
it.
So let's do that there. But I just thought I'd drop that seed as well. But concerning Rachel, that brings me to another note, and that, of course, is in... yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to make sure because I don't want to miss something. There, if we are the verses chapter 48, verses 3 through 7, are you leaving that yet? Because if you are, I have something.
Not yet.
Okay.
No, I'm going to stick with 7 because, and this is again just concerning Rachel in this little passage here, because I really like Friedman's note. I think that this is important. He writes, verse 7 fits uncomfortably in its context, connecting neither to the preceding nor the following verses. It merges as elements of two sources. It refers to Padam Aram, which is characteristic of P, but it says, quote, there is still a span of land to come to Ephrat. And it refers to Rachel being buried on the Ephrat road, which comes from E. This is Genesis chapter 35, verses 16 to 20.
Yeah.
It therefore appears, Ross, to be an addition that the redactor made to the text. Perhaps its function was to separate the two conflicting passages about Ephraim and Manasseh that precede and follow it. And then he goes on to say, alternatively, this verse might be all P because it fits with the next P passage, 49:29 to 33. As a unit, these two passages could be saying, quote, as for me, Rachel died and was buried on the road, but when I die, I want to be buried back in my ancestral tomb with the other patriarchs and matriarchs. It is therefore uncertain, Ross, he says, whether verse 7 is P or R. Do you have an opinion?
I have something that ties to verse 7, but I want you to go ahead and make sure I don't want to jump over something that you have important. All I can say is that it is definitely, well, let me not say definitely, it is not E. It is not E, and there's a reason I'm highlighting that, because what Friedman is arguing is whether this passage, verse 7, is a redactor or P, right? I mean, he's trying to determine that. And that is probably above my pay grade at this point. But I do have a question about verses 3 through 7 that I think ties into what you're going into here. Can I jump on that?
Go on. Yeah, absolutely.
Let me do this because I think it ties in. Now, here's what if verses 3 through 7, the story of the adoption, what if that is a plant in an earlier text? Let me show the viewers what I'm talking about. If we begin in verse 1 of 48, it says, and it came to pass after these things that one said to Joseph, behold, thy father is sick, and he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And one told Jacob and said, behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee. And Israel gathered himself and sat upon the bed. Skip down to verse 8. And Israel beheld Joseph's sons and said, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, these are my sons whom God hath given me here. The reason that I did that is because we talked about this a few moments ago. How do we know that we have different sources? Quite often, these sources, from careful study, the scholars for a couple of hundred years now have identified where one ends and the other picks up. And if we separate those sources, it reads perfectly well.
It makes perfect sense.
Together, we have a lot of questions because we have, for instance, like Friedman is bringing up, the difficulty between verse 7 and verse 8. And we see quite a bit of that. But I do think that the Elohist, the E source here, is interrupted by several verses 3 through 7, and they're just from a different source in almost all likelihood.
So what I want to highlight in this one, Ross, the inclusion of Ephraim and Manasseh as full tribes, if you like, is the fact that, as I've already mentioned, several scholars propose that the entire Joseph narrative is a later addition to the canonical text. And then it makes you wonder, well, if we extract the narrative, might it then be entertained that Manasseh and Ephraim were originally Rachel's first and second born, respectively? So we've already mentioned in previous Torah portions that Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 15 to 20, where Rachel is weeping for her sons, she refuses to be comforted regarding her sons. And it goes on neither to mention Joseph or Benjamin by name, but rather Ephraim, right? But consider also, and we're going to be doing this in more detail when we get there again, so we won't go into too much detail now, but the tribal lists of Numbers, and in particular Numbers chapter 13, this is something that Dershowitz picks up in his valediction of Moses, right?
Yeah.
He says, verse 8 uniformly lists Ephraim without any reference to Joseph. Whereas in verse 11 of Numbers chapter 13, the standard phrase from the tribe of Manasseh is prefaced awkwardly with from the tribe of Joseph, right? It doesn't do that to Ephraim, but it does it to Manasseh in Numbers chapter 13. So this, together with a similar secondary insertion in Numbers chapter 1, verse 10, supports the idea of an editorial attempt to bring the text in line with a latter tribal scheme that includes Joseph over an already existing record that contained Ephraim and Manasseh. Another example of this, Ross, is again in Numbers, and again we'll go into more detail when we get there, but Numbers chapter 26, verses 28 to 38. Like the Moses scroll, it lists Manasseh, Ephraim, and Benjamin, right? But here it has similarly inserted Joseph envelope. It has, these are the tribes of Joseph, and then it goes Manasseh. We've got these ones, we've got Ephraim, we have these ones, we have Benjamin, we have these ones, and then at the end it says, don't forget, this is Joseph, right? So on this, Knierim and Coates, in their commentary on the forms of the Old Testament literature, which I thought was really good, I'm just going to quote from them.
Okay.
They say, quote, Manasseh and Ephraim are both subordinated under Joseph as a single structural entry in the list, leaving only 11 tribal categories, right? See, what happens is when you confine that to Joseph, all of a sudden we have 11 tribes, right? Tribal categories. The subordination is accomplished by including the Ephraim-Manasseh entries within introductory and concluding Joseph formulas, designating Joseph as the major category. Since the concluding Joseph formula has no reference to the total number in the group, right, 12 tribes, the inclusion is weakened. It suggests, they say, that the original structure of the list is built on Manasseh and Ephraim as elements in a 12-fold pattern. They're saying that that's the earlier form.
Who are these guys? Just who are they? I don't recognize the names.
This is
commentators.
Yeah, these are commentators. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
It's one of my go-tos. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Knierim quotes.
So the bottom line is, if some of these scholars, and I know you're going to get into this more as we get into the unfolding story, but as far as I understand, some scholars believe that Joseph, the person of Joseph, and the novella is a later addition, but the original tribes, if I'm not mistaken, you're saying Rachel's boys really are going to be Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin.
And this seems to be what the Moses scroll is implying as well. We have evidence of it in the canonical script text. And the interesting thing about it, Ross, is if that is the case, if Manasseh, Ephraim are the first and second born of Rachel, and Benjamin is the third, well, it's a bit hard to mess with that history and expect them to swallow it if you're going to say, well, actually, there was Joseph, unless you make it attractive to them, unless you bring them back in somehow. And this is where I say this is, where chapter 48 is so important, because what you have is Jacob, Israel, adopting them back into the narrative as full tribes, and not just full tribes, Ross, but now, after all of this, their patriarch, if you like, is the most beloved of Jacob. Not just that, but he was he became the ruler, in fact, a father to Pharaoh, it says. And not just that, but he married an Egyptian priestess, so that now they have priestly lineage as well. And not just that, but it was the favorite mother. And not just that, Ross, but they are now going to replace Reuben and Simeon. But not just that, Ross. You get a set of steak knives as well. No, not just that, but you, instead of Manasseh being the firstborn, we're now going to place Ephraim with Manasseh and make him the firstborn. And that brings me to another note from Friedman, if I may, and that's just on the next page from where I was, concerning verse 22, 48:22. Let me just find that. Yeah, so 48:22, and this is the E source, I do believe, and it says, let me start from 21. And Israel said to Joseph, "Here, I'm dying, and God will be with you and will bring you back to your father's land. And I've given you one shoulder above your brothers, which I took from the Amorite's hand with my sword and my bow." I want to ask you about that in just a little while. We do that, and we'll do that next. Let me just read this note from Friedman. He says, the word for shoulder here is, in the Hebrew, Shechem. Mm-hmm. That is, it is a pun in which Jacob gives his Joseph an extra Shechem, an extra shoulder, an extra Shechem. Shechem was Jeroboam's capital of the northern kingdom in Israel. It was located in one of the Joseph tribes' territory. And he references 1 Kings 12-25. He says, the northern source thus conveys the favored status of the northern kingdom, just as J favors the status of the southern kingdom of Judah in Jacob's deathbed blessing of Judah in the following chapter, right? So it goes on. But it's interesting, and I wonder about that, because you always have to ask the question, if this is a diaspora novella, if this is a story that's added much later, what is its purpose and who does it stand to benefit? And the top of that list is Ephraim. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of points on that. If some of this is new to some of our viewers, then I do highly recommend Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, and one of the mainstays of research in not only the documentary hypothesis, but in source criticism and, where do these stories come from? There is good evidence that what we have now is a combination of texts which come from the north and texts which come from the south. And some of this Joseph material is going to come from the north, at least according to these theories. Now, it's interesting. You were just in verse 21 and 22 of chapter 48. I just want to add one other thing. It says, and Israel said unto Joseph, behold, I die, but God will be with you, plural, and bring you again, plural, unto the land of your fathers, plural. So
we need a translation that utilizes y'all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is interesting though, because we don't see a lot of times in English translations the the person and so forth, whether it's singular, plural, any of that. But when you look at the Hebrew, you see that this is a case. And what we do find sometimes is this address. Now, a fundamentalist would come up with other reasons why there is a switching between plural and singular, because when you get to verse 22, it switches back to the singular. It's just that one verse. Yes, just that one verse. Moreover, I've given to thee. See, in the Old English, thee is singular. Given thee one portion. Now, the other thing, just to consider, and maybe we'll link Edon Dershowitz's book, the valediction of Moses
The valediction of Moses, yeah.
below, because one of the things that he does, he makes some of the very arguments that you're making, and one of the things that he brings up is the location of Shechem. So we can say it like I say it in the South, we say Shechem, but Shechem, we go to the place that is called Shechem now when we go on our tour, but Edan Dershowitz places it more towards the Jordan Valley. Is that right?
I'm not so sure about you. You probably know more about that than I. But the interesting thing about Shechem is that it's supposedly at the foot of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim.
Well, that's what
and yet, I don't believe that there is any verse that connects the two. I don't think that when Shechem is mentioned, that ever is Mount Ebal or Mount Gerizim mentioned in the vicinity. There might be a verse, if I remember correctly, there might be a verse that makes mention of Elon Moreh.
Well, maybe I conflated the ideas just thinking about Ebal and Gerizim and where it's currently located. Maybe Edan doesn't have
a lot of questions about it, though, isn't there?
Yeah.
No, but he does question the whereabouts of Ebal and Gerizim, and he certainly places those, to your point, in the Jordan Valley. And I was going to add to that. No, I had a train of thought, and the train has left. There'll be another train soon.
That's okay. Speaking of all of that Joseph material and Jacob and Shechem, how did Jacob end up with Shechem? You know, it seems like we've got a couple of different stories there.
Right. Well, this is what I was going to ask you about, because verse 22 ends that way.
Hang on. I'm sorry. I want to know if it's with a bow. He says he took it with his bow. So I don't know. Did he take it with his bow or with a sword, or took it from an Amorite, or did he buy it with money? All right, go ahead. Verse 22.
You explain it to me, please.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, that in verse 22, like you said, I took out of the hand of the Amorite. I have all kind of questions. I don't think we can answer them all here. You know, we've talked before about the Amorite. Is the Amorite a singular people among the 7 Canaanite peoples, or is it the main people? I mean, I tell you, there is a lot that I am currently interested in that I don't quite have all the answers to. When we get to Deuteronomy, we get to the Moses scroll. You know, it talks about the mountain, or the mount of the Amorite mountain. What is that? But anyway, it seems to represent the hill country. And one of the things that's really interesting here that makes me think, 48:22 says, took it from the Amorite with the bow. If you read chapter 33 and verse 19, Genesis, look at Genesis 33:19. Let's see why I have that in my notes. I think I remember.
All right. Well, what I have, I'll go from 18. It says, Jacob arrived safe in the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, having come thus from Padan Aram, and he encamped before the city. The parcel of land where he pitched his tent and purchased from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 kesitas, Ross? And he set up an altar there, and he called it El Eloi Yisrael. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know. That's one story. That's one story that we have on how he ended up in possession of this place. And then the other footnote I have is chapter 34, verses 25 through 29.
That's right.
And pass on the third day. There's a big fight.
There's a big fight, and this is attributed to a different source. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I believe so.
I have a feeling that it is. On the third day, when they were in pain, Simeon and Levi, 2 of Jacob's sons, brothers of Dinah, each took his sword, came up on the city and molested and slew all the males. That's a pretty busy day right there, Ross.
That is a busy day, yeah. So you have to wonder which one is it, and I don't know. Even if you put aside all the discussion of sources and you try to make sense of it all the way we have it, the question is still there. In other words, could it be? I've tried to even make sense of it with all of the various different options. Like Jacob and the children of Israel are living in that region. The incident with Dinah takes place and the slaughter. Because you have to wonder, because ultimately what we see is that the Joseph tribes end up with that region in their property. In fact, we even have in Joshua, I have a note. Look at Joshua 24. I think it's verse 32. Joshua 24:32 says, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem in the parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money, and they became the inheritance of the children of Joseph.
I'm so glad that you clarified that, because that was going to be my next question, because this is something that we always do on the Tanakh tours, that we go and visit the traditional site of Ibal and Gerizim, which I would argue is Samaritan revisionism. But while we're there, and it's great, I love it, from Elon Moraine, the most spectacular views, it's definitely worth doing with our tour guide Gershon. But while we're there, right, we go around and we have a look down into Shechem, and we can hear it. And Shechem, is now, of course, known as Nablus.
Yeah.
There is no way that we would go down into Nablus because it's just a hotbed of Islamists.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd feel very secure down there. But there is Gershon will point out to us. You see down there. Okay, now you see this landmark. Now go to the left, and you see that landmark. Now you see that white dome down there.
Yep.
That is traditionally understood to be Joseph's tomb.
Mm-hmm.
Every year, it must be around this time, I suppose, that the Israeli military make it safe for the faithful to go and pay tribute and pray at the tomb there.
Yeah,
it's a remarkable experience. I really do love going to that lookout and seeing it.
I do too. And people can debate various locations, but it is absolutely a stunning view there. It's one of the prettiest places. I think that whole Elon Moray and in that region there, that whole thing is, to me, one of my favorite
Just amazing
spots. Yeah. So
sure.
Joseph's tomb. But again, in Joshua 24, it matches the other text where it's a purchase. The only thing I can think of is if there is anything that the text where it talks about in verse 22, the sword, or the Amorite took it from the Amorite with the bow. The only thing I can think is that if that indicated some fight for that land, and the only fight that I know associated with Israel for that region was the one that Simeon and Levi did. And Jacob was against that. We see that in Genesis 49.
That's right.
He talks about how they were instruments of cruelty in what they did. I don't see that he would later claim any part of that, taking that land with a bow when he was against it.
Well, he certainly didn't approve of it when he found out what happened.
Right.
He said, "Now you're going to turn everyone in the region against me."
Yep.
So. But again, different sources, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Listen, unless you have more to say about that, I didn't want to go too much further. I wanted to just come back a few verses because I wanted to ask you about verse 16.
Okay.
In fact, let's start with verse 15. And he blessed Joseph, saying, "The God in whose ways my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd from my birth to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, bless the lads." Who is the angel, Ross?
That, I was really hoping you could tell me that. Is it the angel of the Lord, the Malach? Who is it that redeemed Jacob? Why would he call that one the messenger? Now, there is an interesting thing that, at least it comes to my mind, whenever you think of Jacob and messengers, it puts us back at Bethel. It puts us back at the dream of the Sulam, the ladder, Jacob's ladder. And on that ladder are messengers ascending and descending. That whole story is jam-packed with the language of messengers. In fact, he calls the place very close to there. there's a lot to do with messengers now. But how literally do we take this? Does he think of because a messenger can be a person, a human.
Mm,
Esau is in that narrative with Esau. There are human messengers, and they're called
yep,
Malachim as well.
as
Uh,
well.
but I don't think he's talking about a human messenger here.
Mm,
It's in the text. It comes across to me as if it is, for lack of a better way to put it, an angelic messenger. What are your thoughts? Do you
mm.
think?
Yeah, he seems to be including it as a supernatural entity because you have God in whose ways, God who has been my shepherd, the angel who has redeemed me. In them may my name be recalled, and the names of my fathers. And well, see, that's interesting, isn't it? In
Yeah,
them may my name be recalled.
yeah,
That's just, I mean, I don't know what to do with that. I
yeah.
tell you what, though, it does. If I just go forward just a little bit, and I don't know if I'm just being nitpicky and reading into it, you let me know. But verse 25 of chapter 49. It says, the God of your father who helps you, and Shaddai who blesses you. More specifically in the Hebrew, by El and by Shaddai. So is he talking about two different entities here, Ross?
I don't know. You're getting kind of. I don't
It's
know.
not the only place, though, is it?
Yeah.
I
Oh,
mean, I
I know.
remember there was
No.
another verse a little
Look,
bit
I have.
earlier on where he seems to make reference to two entities as well. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say the Hebrew Bible has quite a bit of that, and I've happened to be familiar with some works on my bookshelves where they have those very things. I mean, Genesis 19 and verse 24. Some more mystically inclined and looking deeply at the text have seen, for instance, where one Yod He Vav He calls down fire from Yod He Vav He in heaven. It can at
Mm,
least be read as one working in tandem with another. Now, of course, a lot of people would look at that and say, no, 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 you're reading things into the text. But to your point, there are texts which read oddly enough to where it makes you have to scratch your head and say, "Wait a minute,
mm.
what's going on here?"
And we discussed, and we'll get there eventually again, but we have already discussed one of those in the latter chapters of Deuteronomy. But we'll touch on that where it talks about, I think, Elohim being subordinate to Jehovah, or perhaps
Yeah,
the other way around. And this is borne out in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But again, we'll touch on that later on. But it is interesting. This is just perhaps another example of that. Chapter
you,
49.
you like
Good heavens!
prophecy. You like prophecy,
Go
Jono.
ahead, Ross.
I mean,
I've become
this is the
I'll be honest, I've become a little bit less of a fan
yeah.
of
Well,
prophecy, but go ahead. What do you
well,
got?
let's bring you back in, Jono. I want you to
All right, let's
explain
go.
to our viewers because this is not for your average Bible student here. You have to look deeply because it begins. Jacob is going to call his sons to his
Mm,
bedside. We've seen this in other patriarchal
hmm.
narratives, but this one is a little bit different because let's maybe we get Ezra to read
Yeah.
Genesis 49 verses 1 and 2.
And Jacob called unto his sons, and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the latter days. Assemble yourselves, and hear, ye sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father.
All right. Now,
This immediately reminds me of the Beatles, the song "Come Together."
come
He
together.
summons. I love that song. He
Yeah.
summons Jacob summons all his sons and says, "Come together over me, that I may tell you what is to befall you in the days to come." And what he's doing is it sounds like Ross. It sounds like he's about to address his sons, and he's going to say to them, "Look, this is what you have to look forward to." But then
Yep.
he goes into, and I wonder if this is really actually if this just has an anachronistic tone all the way through. Um, that perhaps the writer of chapter 49 is saying, this is how it pans out for you. I know because I'm here, So, and he's talking to
Yeah.
them and addressing them in a tribal sense rather than an individual sense. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, we have a couple of different lists like this, don't we? We have this list of
Mm,
prophecies of the tribe. Deuteronomy also has prophecies of the tribes.
yeah.
I've kind of come through that genre and that world of the tribes. I mean, I have loved
Mm.
stories. I've got shelves of books on the lost tribes, and we have all of these interesting stories. And one of
Mm.
the things is that when you put them together, there are distinct differences between the list, for one. But
Mhm.
that's not a problem because you have different people giving those lists, right? But what
Sure.
is interesting is that you highlighted the Beatles gather, come together. You
Come
have
together. Mm.
gather and assemble, which
Mm.
those together occur quite a few times in the Bible, most often in later prophecies, dealing with the tribes. So, for instance, Isaiah 11 uses these two verbs together, almost the exact language.
Really? I
Yeah,
did
yeah,
not know
yeah.
that.
That's right. That's right.
Ah,
So,
fascinating. Didn't
but
know that.
but now, so the question is, why is that? One answer, a very fundamentalist answer, Jono, would be,
Mm.
well, because Jacob is uttering prophetic words here. When he says the latter days, it's Akarit Hayamim, the latter days, the last days. And
Mhm.
so, what many people have done, and I've spent countless hours on this myself and have in past many enjoyable hours trying to figure out what this is telling me about these individual tribes and their roles in the future. To your point, the question really becomes, is it looking from antiquity to a later date, or is a writer in that later time putting that anachronistically back into the mouth of
Mm.
Jacob? Now, what is fascinating is, and people have made a lot of this, when you look and you read the tribes, the blessings associated with the tribes, you'll see a couple of things that stand out. As I recall, Judah and Joseph are addressed directly. Reuben is as well, not so favorably, but Reuben is as well.
Mm.
But the others, that it's spoken as if in the third person, describing what's going to happen to them in the latter days.
Interesting.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's like because you mentioned when we started this episode that everything in Genesis kind of points to this point. And
Mm.
if you recall, as we work towards the latter part of the book, you get to 37, we meet Joseph. 38
Mhm.
interrupts the Joseph saga with a story of Judah, and then they come together, they assemble
Come together.
themselves at the end, and it's almost as if the writer is beautifully saying,
Mm.
Jono, Judah and Joseph, because they both love the Father so much, it brings about the restoration of Israel. Now, I think that a
Mm.
later writer, a prophetic voice, saying similarly, when Judah and Joseph love the Father more than anything else, and they make that the priority, that brings about the restoration of Israel. I think that could easily be the message that the writer, the redactor, is putting
Wanting to convey.
kind of behind the scene. I mean,
Mm.
some might argue and say, no, 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 it's historical and so forth. And I could say, well, could it be both? That's the question.
Mm. I really do love it, Ross. I love the way, I think it's very, very clever that the final redactor, if I could put it that way, brought all the sources together to craft them into this direction and to culminate in chapters 48 and 49. I just think it really is very, very clever. And I think that is what's happening. Is there anything, and I got to say, by the way, if I had to be, if I wanted to really enjoy a blessing, I particularly like Zebulun's and Asher's. So Zebulun, verse 13, shall dwell by the seashore, and he shall have a haven for ships, and his flanks shall be on Sidon. Love it. That's great.
Is
But
that your favorite?
even more than that, well, I don't know. You tell me. It's either that one or Asher. Asher's bread shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties.
Yeah. I tell you, no, they're
I
all
love it.
really interesting when you read them. And
Mm.
some of these are not quite so easy to understand. I give you an
Yeah, some of these
example.
you don't want.
Yeah,
Yeah,
some of them you don't want, and some of them we've
a bit
place
obscure.
them in a category, let's say, of messianic prophecies, and yet no
Go on.
one can really tell us a whole lot about them. Like, for instance, in fact, I'm going to ask Ezra to tell us a little bit about Genesis 49:10 and how that is considered a messianic prophecy.
Genesis 49 verse 10 is often seen as a messianic prophecy because of its reference to rulership and the expectation of a future ideal leader. Here's the verse. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the obedience of the peoples be. The scepter and ruler's staff symbolize kingship and authority, marking Judah as the tribe destined for leadership. The phrase, until Shiloh come, is the focal point. Shiloh has been interpreted in various ways, including as a messianic title. Some understand it to mean he to whom it belongs, implying the rightful king or a figure of ultimate authority. This connects to the broader expectation of a future ruler who would bring peace and justice, a concept central to messianic hope. In Jewish tradition, this verse is often tied to the Davidic line, from which the Messiah is expected to emerge. In Christian tradition, it is interpreted as a prophecy of Jesus, who is seen as fulfilling the role of the ultimate ruler to whom the peoples will gather. The verse's emphasis on lasting authority and eventual universal obedience makes it a natural anchor for messianic expectations in both traditions.
How about that?
That is one of our favorite destinations too. While we're talking about that, Shiloh, of course, Ross. We go there every single year on the Tanakh tour, and it's one of my favorite places. I think it's one of yours as well. But that, of course, is where the tabernacle is understood to have stood for 369 years, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
So what's your thoughts? What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I tell you, I'm glad Ezra did an excellent job of sort of summarizing that, because the words are very they're ambiguous in some ways, and we don't know exactly what they mean. Now, I know people out there listening, and some of our viewers are jumping up and down saying, "Ooh, I know what it means," but the truth is that it's debated. Let me put it that way. I'm sure most of our viewers know quite a bit about this, but the Ad Ki Yavo Shiloh is Ad Ki Yavo, until he comes, or until Shiloh comes. Ad Ki Yavo Shiloh, until he comes. If it was until he comes to Shiloh, as in a location, then it would have it would have some, or L, it would have some directional indication in the Hebrew.
Yep.
But it doesn't. And so what I find, you'll notice that a lot of times in English translations, the S of Shiloh is capitalized so that it becomes a personal name. Again, it's just one of those texts. We have one other messianic text that I'll just mention. Some have considered in verse 49, chapter 49, verse 24, to also be messianic, and it's also kind of strange. And
by
what
the
I'm
hands of the mighty one of Jacob, there, the shepherd, the rock of Israel. Go ahead.
Yeah, Misham, literally Misham, from there. From where? From Joseph. So the idea that some have taken away is that you have, and many of our viewers know this, you have a view in Judaism that it begins to emerge. You have not one Messiah, Jono, as later Christianity developed, solely everything went into one, but there were multiple Messiahs, two, a Joseph Messiah and a Judah Messiah, which makes much more sense when you look at particularly the Pentateuch as we have it now. The Dead Sea Scrolls at times will mention multiple messiahs, and we get that in the Hebrew Bible too. The book of Zechariah, two messiahs.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
This is a question that you are likely to know the answer to. It only just popped into my head, but looking at Genesis chapter 49, verse 28, in fact, is the repetition, or the confirmation, if you like, of 12 tribes of Israel. It reminds me a little bit, we've had the discussion before about the 10 commandments, and the fact that there's only 9 commandments listed in the canonical text, either in Exodus or in Deuteronomy, but there are 10 in the Moses scroll. But we know there are supposed to be 10 because, as you've pointed out on numerous occasions, there are 3 places that refer to 10 commandments, 10 Devarim. Right. And so here what we have is 12 tribes of Israel, and that's reiterated all through the Tanakh. There seems to be no question that there is 12. The only question is, who exactly are the 12? Does it include Manasseh, Ephraim, or does it include Joseph and Levi? So I wonder, Ross, if you know how many times 12 tribes is mentioned in the Tanakh.
I tell you what I can do is I can look at that quickly because I have fancy tools.
I know you
And
do.
what is the verse? Genesis 49,
Well, this one is
28.
49:28. This is just one example.
49:28. So let's pull
It was
that up, and
12
it
and
says,
tribes.
yeah, let's see. That exact phrase, let me see. Now, it might be worded slightly different, but this
Might be worded,
precise
yeah.
phrase, okay, that's only once in that
What?
configuration. In that configuration.
Oh, in that particular
Yeah.
configuration.
So let me look at it this way.
But 12 and tribes.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit harder than that, but
That's interesting. So this.
okay. Okay. So let's look. If we have Genesis 49:28, let me open up the Hebrew window so I can see that as well. The next passage that is similar, that mentions 12 tribes of Israel, is Exodus 24:4, and Moses wrote all the words of Jehovah and rose up early in the morning and builded an altar. And then Ezekiel 47. So I think it's the wording is slightly different. So anyway,
Well, we're going to let the viewers, if you have an opinion on this, I'd love to know how many times does 12 and tribes in reference to 12 tribes of Israel appear in the Tanakh. There's a
now,
question
by the way,
that I would like to have answered.
By the way, if I change the configuration, I just look up 12 tribes, but it's in referring to Israel. I find it in addition to Genesis 49:28, Exodus 24:4, Exodus 28:21, Exodus 39:14. So there are quite a few. But again, the bigger question, and you and I have had some interesting discussions on this for many years about Levi and the organization that I've been a part of for a lot of the last several years, United Israel, and even the logo of United Israel. We've talked about the tribes, so quite interesting. Do you have anything else on the 12 tribes you wanted to cover?
8, 9. I've got 9.
Yeah.
9 references, and then there's some in the New Testament as well. But the combination of those two words, 12 and tribes, and I'm just looking in the English, Genesis 49:28, where we are, and that's the first one.
Yeah.
That is actually the first, it would appear. Exodus 24:4, as you pointed out, 28:21,
Got it.
39:14,
Got it.
Joshua 3:12, 4:8, 1 Kings 18:31, Ezra chapter 6, verse 17, and Ezekiel 47:13. I would have thought, though, Ross, that there'd be more, but that's a lot anyway.
That's a lot. That's a lot. Well, but one thing that's certain is that, as you pointed out, it is consistent in the Hebrew Bible that there are 12 in number. The question becomes, what are they 12 in what name? And that's the big question.
Specifically, 12 in what name? Hebron, of course, another place that we love to go to every time on the Tanakh when we're in Israel. That's where Jacob wants to be buried, and the narrative takes us there, and he's embalmed, and there's really a massive procession, Ross.
Yep, that's right. And our story ends. It begins in life and ends in death in some ways, because Joseph is in a box, and and then the next Torah portion, we're going to be in the book of Exodus, Jono. Is there anything else? I mean, the book of Genesis has been quite a journey. I think we've covered quite a bit. And all of this, quite a bit of this, is setting the stage for the entrance into the book of Exodus. Did you have any words to bring us from one to the next?
Only that chapter 50, this talks about eventually how Joseph died. In fact, the last verse says Joseph died at the age of 110 years old. He was also embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. And we're to understand that, during the Exodus, he is carried out of there. But the interesting thing about this is that we have Jacob dying at 147, 17 years. So I guess when he dies, Joseph is 47. That makes sense, does it? Does that make sense? Because he was 30 when he rose to power. And then, okay, so he's 47. He lives to 110. And the math on that is 63 years, Ross. Is that right? So this chapter just sort of jumps over the latter 63 years of Joseph's life.
Yeah, we're going to have to do some real math. I'm going to have to work on this in the intervening week because, I have
Something
a question.
like that, anyway.
How long were they in Egypt? We're going to have a lot of math to do here.
Mm-hmm.
And so how long were they actually enslaved?
That's
Because
right.
they're there for
That
a
is a
certain
question.
amount of time, and we have to figure up the ages of these people. And oh man, I tell you, before this is over,
Shemot.
I might actually be getting pretty good at this stuff.
Shemot is coming up next week. We're going to be kicking off in Exodus. That is it for Genesis. Is there anything else that you want to add there, Ross?
I tell you what, I just hope that everyone buckles down and gets ready for the book of Exodus because, Jono, I'm going to tell you, I love Genesis. I love all the Bible, but I love the story of Moses. And we
Really?
are
Yeah.
just about to get into Moses. And I'd like to tell people, if you don't have it yet, get the Exodus Torah tablet. It is available. The link is in the description. And get ready because the book of Exodus, the story of Moses, we are jumping in feet first next week at this time. What else,
That is
Jono?
it for VaYechi. That's all that we have. And so we'll be back this time next week. Ezra, take us on out.
Well, folks, that wraps up another enlightening episode of Torah Pearls. We've journeyed through the blessings, the prophecies, and the legacy of Jacob in VaYechi, and even dabbled in some messianic mysteries along the way. Whether you're Team Ephraim or still puzzling over Shiloh, there's no denying the depth and layers in these ancient texts. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, we love hearing your thoughts, questions, and insights. Don't forget to share the show with a friend who could use a bit of Torah-inspired wisdom in their week. Until next time, may your studies be sweet, your coffee strong, and your questions endless. Shalom.